Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Hedrick Smith to you. He saw the introduction and he said, "That's way too long." He said, "Cut that out." And I didn't tell him that I already did cut it out. So you'll have to pretend, because he's done a lot on PBS, that there's a rolling screen of credits in back of you, invisible, but you'll need to keep that in your mind as I go through, because this is a man whose journalistic career has spanned everything from civil rights up to today. He spent 26 years, 1962 to 88, with the New York Times, covered Martin Luther King Jr., Vietnam War in Saigon, Middle East conflicts in Cairo, the Cold War from both Moscow and Washington, and in 1971 he was part of the team that won a Pulitzer Prize for their coverage of the Pentagon Papers. His first book, The Russians, was an international bestseller and has been translated into 16 languages. So imagine those credits are still rolling up here about a lot of the things I'm not saying. So he moved to PBS in 1989, and since then he's created 26 primetime specials and miniseries on varied topics such as terrorism, Wall Street, Walmart, Exxon, tax evasion, the educational system, healthcare, the environment, and jazz greats Duke Ellington and Dave Brubeck, and also Washington, D.C.'s Power Game. He's won many of television's major awards. Two of his frontline programs, Wall Street Fix and Can You Afford to Retire, won Emmy Awards, and two others, Critical Conditions and Tax Me If You Can, were nominated. And twice he has won or shared the grand prize for the year's Best Public Affairs Program in U.S. television for Inside Gorbachev's USSR in 1990 and Inside the Terror Network in 2002. Finally, and I'll cut it off here, for over 25 years, if you watched PBS, you saw Hedrick Smith as a principal panelist on Washington Week in Review. But today, no man to rest on his laurels, he's here at City Club to talk about the dramatic and pervasive economic shift that have occurred in our country since the 1970s, which he documented in his latest book, Who Stole the American Dream? Please join me in welcoming Hedrick Smith.
We have a dance routine up here. We're just practicing.
The credits are still rolling.
Don, thank you. And thank all of you for coming. It's a thrill and a pleasure for me to see so many people here in Bellingham. What Don didn't mention, and which is very important, is that my wife Susan and I, and Susan is in the back of the room, I think, or did she step out? Susan, stand up. My wife Susan and I are your neighbors. We have a home on Orcas Island. We've been coming to Orcas Island for the last dozen years, so we feel very much at home in the Pacific Northwest. We have kids and grandchildren in West Seattle. The rest of the time we live about a mile from the White House in Washington, D.C. Now, a couple of you all, as we were getting ready to start the occasion today, mentioned to me Washington Week in Review, which Don kindly mentioned. I just wondered if there were people here who remember Washington Week in Review Friday night with Paul Duke. A few people. So let me tell you a Friday night Washington Week in Review story. For those of you who don't know, Paul Duke was the moderator. He would sit at one end of the table. And four of us reporters would take turns taking a chunk of the news, the presidency, the Congress, the courts, Health and Human Services, whatever were the stories of the week. And we would lead the discussion for, say, 5 or 6 minutes of the show, and then we have a general discussion. Now, people on this program are typically guys like Jack Nelson, who was the Washington bureau chief of the Los Angeles Times, and Haynes Johnson of the Washington Post, and Charlie McDowell, who was a down-home guy from Richmond Times-Dispatch with a real Southern accent. Now, Charlie was the guy who was always sort of the utility infielder. He handled the story that nobody else sort of was after. And that almost always meant that he sat in the number 4 seat, which meant that he was asking questions of the others for a long part of the program until he got his turn. So he got a letter one time from a couple in Upper New York State. And they said, it was only 3 sentences long. The first sentence said, "Sometimes it seems as though you don't understand what the others are talking about." And the second sentence said, "Neither do we." And the third sentence said, "So it's a comfort to have you there." So that's going to be the last laugh we're going to have today. I'm going to talk about serious stuff. I figured I got to start with a joke. I got to start with a nice story because we're going to get into some heavy lifting here. But you're here, I think, because you have a very thoughtful and intelligent club. I think it's wonderful that you have a Bellingham City Club, that people are called together and you want to come together to talk about serious subjects, whether they're local or national or international, whether they're economic or they're business or they're political, whatever. And I just applaud you and tell you how pleased I am to be part of that. I think it's very, very important to our democracy that groups like this get together. And I wish I could stay in a light vein, but I have to say to you that, and I'm telling you something that's not going to come as a surprise to you, but we're meeting on an absolutely gorgeous day, in an absolutely beautiful setting, in a wonderful city, at a very troubling time for our country, okay? So when we walk out of here and we live the lives that we live, we're looking at something that's very not representative of where the country is. And I want to talk to you about where the country is and how it got to where it is, and then maybe a little bit about what we might be able to do about it. In the period of reporting that I've done, which now spans gulp 50 years, I can remember that we have moved as a country from a time when we were a nation of shared prosperity, where we had effective bipartisan politics, where Republicans and Democrats could fight and disagree and compete in elections, and then after the elections get together, disagree some more, but battle out compromises. In the year I first went to Washington in 1962, all right, 51 years ago. At that time, and for quite a long time after that, Congress passed budgets every year. Today they can't pass a budget. Passing a budget involves passing 13 appropriations bills for the different departments of the government. So you don't just pass one piece of legislation. You got to have pass 13 authorizations bills to authorize the spending and 13 appropriations bills to spend the money. 26 pieces of legislation plus a budget, probably 2 budgets, 28 pieces of legislation. Today they can't pass one. How do we get from there to here? How do we get from a shared prosperity to wildly gaping inequalities in our income? From an effective bipartisan politics to politics that are polarized and paralyzed in Washington today. That's the story I'm interested in. That's what this book, Who Stole the American Dream, is about. That's what I've been working on for the last 3 or 4 years of my life. Now, I want to step back for a minute and suggest to you that the stakes may be even larger than you think they are. When I went to Oxford, one of the people I read was the great British historian Arnold Toynbee. Toynbee wrote a book called A Study of History. Actually, he didn't write a book. He wrote 12 books. There were 12 volumes. I read the cheater's version of it. It was 2 volumes, and that was only 1,300 pages long. Toynbee studied 21 civilizations over 6,000 years. And he tried to understand the rise and fall of civilizations from the beginning of recorded historical human time to when he was writing in the 1950s. And what he did was he concluded that civilizations rise and fall on a pattern of challenge and response. All civilizations are challenged in some way. The question is, how do they respond to that challenge? And are they going to survive? Are they going to endure? Are they going to become greater? Or are they going to fall into decline and slowly disappear, or maybe rapidly disappear? Now, most of us tend to think of challenge and response in a rather simplistic way because of our experience in the 20th century, and that is in terms of war. But Toynbee thought about it much more broadly than that. The ancient civilizations of Egypt and the Nile Delta and the Inca civilization in South America faced an environmental challenge, first of all. Could they overcome hostile environmental conditions well enough to establish an agricultural not manufacturing, not high tech, an agricultural society capable of supporting thousands of people, large institutions, and now think about it, and building those pyramids and building those remarkable temples and so forth at Machu Picchu. That's a very sophisticated civilization. But first of all, they had to overcome the environmental challenge. They did. But then they fell victim years later, or centuries later, to the military challenge of a hostile power from the outside. In the case of Egypt, Ottoman Turkey. In the case of the Incas in Latin America, Imperial Spain from Europe. And they fell victim to that. Now that's the kind of challenge we understand. That's the kind of challenge that America has done well with. We faced the challenge from Hitler's Europe, Nazi Germany, allied with Japan and Italy. We faced the challenge of Stalin's Russia, the whole Cold War, a battle of ideology, battle of economics, a battle of politics, but above all, a battle of military strength. And we met that challenge in both cases, with Hitler and with the communists. But Toynbee goes on in a rather interesting way to talk about those civilizations that we have special respect and affection for because we've modeled some of our institutions and indeed many of our buildings on them, ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Now what's interesting about ancient Greece and ancient Rome is that in the end, they fell victim not to external challenges, but to what Toynbee calls schisms in the soul of the society. He uses that term, schisms in the soul and schisms in the body social. We would use the term the body politic today. Internal schisms. Ancient Greece and ancient Rome fell into decline because they could not cope with the challenge from within. Ladies and gentlemen, my assertion today, my argument today is that we face a challenge from within, which is a graver, more difficult challenge to cope with than the external challenges that we have successfully met in the past. Look at us. We are a divided society. We are divided by money enormously. We have, in the estimation of Citigroup, not in the estimation of Paul Krugman and Joe Stiglitz and a bunch of liberal economists, but the estimate of one of the largest banking institutions of America. We have the greatest, and these are Citibank's assessments, sent out to their own investors, have the greatest inequality of income in any major power since 16th century Spain. Okay? There are lots of other people, lots of other numbers. I'm not going to bother you with them. Some of them are in my book. So we have that division. We have division of power. People are concerned in America today, and quite rightly so, with the influence of money in politics, particularly the influence of a small number of people with lots of money. I can't remember the exact number at the moment, but I think 32 people gave more than 60% of the money to super PACs and 527 organizations in the last election. It's a very small number of people. It represents 0.0001342% of the population spending that kind of money. So we're unequal that way. We have a starkly unequal democracy in a lot of ways today. Still one person, one vote, but money talks, and the public in general doesn't have much of a voice in that conversation. That's important. And then finally, you know it, we're divided by ideology. We're divided by politics. So the question is, how do we get here? And what can we possibly do about it? Well, when I started to look into this, and I have to tell you, it was literally 4 years ago on Orcas Island that I began doing the reporting and the research for this book. I spent a lot of time, by the way, in the next fall, next year, doing what is basically a chapter of the book about Washington Mutual, not because I was focused on a local bank, but because I was trying to understand what had caused the enormous blow-up of the housing industry and why so many people got hurt, and how we had separated risk from profit in the housing game. And I just used Washington Mutual as a case study. And what I discovered as I started to look into the housing problem was that the main victims of subprime loans were not subprime borrowers. They were prime borrowers. There were people in this room. There were people who deserved prime loans, loans at the lowest possible interest rate with the lowest possible fees. And in fact, many of them got talked into, tricked into, cajoled into, cheated into, lied into loans that were very much against their interest, and indeed 10 to 12 million Americans are still stuck in those loans today. So the first thing I learned was the subprime crisis wasn't really about subprime, it was about prime. It was about the center of the American economic system. The second thing I learned was that American homeowners lost $6 trillion. $6 trillion while the housing boom was going up and the very beginning of it's going down. They didn't lose the money because housing values went down. They lost the money because they were sucking $750 billion a year out of their home equity by taking second home equity loans, by refinancing their houses and having larger and larger loans each time. And people were doing that because they were being told by economists, starting with Alan Greenspan at the Federal Reserve, but lots of other economists as well, that housing prices are going to go up forever, so you might as well refinance and make money on it now. Ladies and gentlemen, that was a sucker story. A lot of us bought it and have paid dearly for it. $6 trillion. How did I get that number? If you go back to the late 1980s, American homeowners owned 70% of the value of their homes, and the banks that finance their mortgages owned the other 30%. Not too abnormal. Flash forward to 2009, American homeowners owned 40% of the value of their homes, which were now worth less anyway, but they owned 40%, and the banks owned 60%. 30% of the value of the entire housing stock in America, worth about $20 trillion, so that's $6 trillion, moved from homeowners to banks and the investors behind the banks during the buildup of the housing boom. Now, I need to tell you, when I started writing this book, the title was not Who Stole the American Dream. The title was The Dream at Risk. I knew, everybody knew. We're having unemployment, massive foreclosures, the economy is tumbling down. It was no trick to say the American dream was at risk. I changed the title to Who Stole the American Dream because as I did the research, I came to understand it didn't just happen to the middle class. It was done to the middle class. Somebody actually stole it. First theft I just gave you, pretty grand larceny, $6 trillion, okay? And a lot of that was done dishonestly. The fraud in the housing industry is staggering. There's chapter and verse on Washington Mutual in my book, but there are lots of other places where you can find it out too. Number one. Number two, that was a wealth shift. There was also an enormous burden shift. And a burden shift that has now become so natural to us we can't imagine that water runs any other way than on the path it's now running. And that's called the 401k. Back when I started reporting, back when a lot of you all started working, when you were preparing for your retirement, there was no 401k. It didn't even exist in the tax code. Most people back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, 84% of the people who worked for companies with 100 or more employees had lifetime pensions promised by their employers. You got a monthly check every day until you died from your employer. Enter the 401k, and the shift of the burden of the cost of paying for retirement goes from the company books to the pocketbooks and checkbooks of ordinary people. Every year, that is hundreds of billions of dollars. Now, the companies say they can't afford to pay it. Does that mean the ordinary people can afford to pay it? I don't think so. And the reason I don't think so is when I went and talked to the people who are experts in retirement benefits, the median 401k balance in America today is $18,000. You should be shaking your heads. The median 401k balance for people in their 60s on the verge of retirement is $85,000. And the median household income in America is $50,000 a year. The financial experts will tell you that you ought to have 10 to 12 times your final income saved up as a nest egg before you retire. So if you're a median family, you should have $500,000 or $600,000. And they got $85,000. Okay, that's the median. The experts I talked to, and again, they're quoted in my book, say that close to half of the baby boomer generation is headed for poverty in retirement. That is another theft, okay? A major theft. Hundreds of billions of dollars a year. Corporations used to spend 7 or 8% of their payroll to finance lifetime pensions. They now spend 2 or 3% of their payroll to finance 401ks. They save 5% of their payroll costs nationwide. That's hundreds of billions of dollars a year, okay? So then I began, as I got into these things, I began to understand that there was a much bigger story that I was looking at than housing and then maybe retirement. And I began to understand that what I was seeing related to some of those documentaries that Don mentioned that I've done for PBS, Can You Afford to Retire? Is Walmart Good for America? Tax Me If You Can, Surviving the Bottom Line. I'd done a whole bunch of them. And I began to understand that what I was seeing as a phenomenon in one sector was actually reflected in other sectors. And I began to think, there's a larger pattern at work here, and I need to write a larger story than the one that I was planning to write or to put on the air with Frontline. The other thing I got reminded of during this early discovery phase of my reporting had to do with the tax system. This is when there was all this argument going on about whether or not we could raise taxes, because if we raised taxes, it would kill growth. And we particularly couldn't raise taxes on the most wealthy people because they were the job creators. So, well, this sophisticated audience. You're going to hear some other stuff that'll resonate. Well, I went back and I took a look, and back when we had 3 or 4% growth as national norm in the 1950s and 60s, do you know what the maximum marginal tax rate was under Dwight Eisenhower, Republican president, for 2 terms in the 1960s? 50s, I'm sorry? 92%. Now, you're told if it's 92%, if you raise that, if you get anywhere above 40% today, you're told it's confiscatory, it would absolutely shut down the economy. So, nonsense. We had some of the best growth in our history in the last 70 years when it was 92%, okay? Then under John F. Kennedy, the tax rate was dropped enormously, down to 77%, okay? So in the 1960s, all the way to Jimmy Carter, all the way through Jimmy Carter, in 1980, we had a 70% tax rate. Now, under Carter, we had lots of other problems, but it didn't have to do with the tax rate. So I thought, I got to get this stuff straight, and I got to understand what was going on. So I went back, and I said, let me take a look at this earlier period and understand why and how we were having these good growth periods at the same time we had high taxes. And I remember, I don't know if you remember, Richard Nixon, when he was Eisenhower's vice president, went to Russia and he had this debate with Nikita Khrushchev when he was head of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. They called it the kitchen debate. It was called the kitchen debate because it was in the kitchen exhibition that we had set up in Moscow to show off all the appliances and the design of American kitchens. We were showing the communists that we were beating the hell out of them in terms of taking care of consumers. And Nixon is lecturing Khrushchev about this, and Khrushchev can't stand it anymore, and finally he says, we're building a classless society in the Soviet Union. And without pausing a second, Nixon stuck his finger in Khrushchev's eye and said, we already have a classless society in America. Now, Nixon was exaggerating. There's no question he was exaggerating. We had inequality. I mean, Charlie Wilson, the head of General Motors at that time, was making 40 times as much as his assembly workers were making. There was inequality of income there. And the top 1% at that time took about 8 or 9% of the income of the country at that time, total income of the country. But we had what economists call the Great Convergence. And by that they mean that the income levels at the top were closer together to the income levels in the middle, were closer together to the incomes at the bottom. There was a convergence in the levels of income. The differentiation among the different strata in American society was much closer than it is today. Doesn't mean we didn't have booms and busts, doesn't mean we didn't have poverty, doesn't mean we didn't have families that were hurting and didn't have enough money. No. But if you look at the way the money was dispersed, the way the pie was cut up, it was cut up much more fairly than it is today. Now, why? Why would that happen? Number one, we know it helped generate very effective economics. The economists have an idea, which they call the virtuous circle of growth. And that is that if you have tens of millions of middle-class people, whatever their jobs, whether they're running grocery stores or working on the assembly line or they're salespeople or they're back office people, whatever, if you pay tens of millions of people good wages and they go out and spend their money, and most middle-class Americans spend most of their money, 95% at least and maybe more, that's what drives the economy. Keep it straight, ladies and gentlemen. The job creators in the American economy are sitting in this room and rooms like this. It is the consumers. 70% of the drive of the American economy. I learned this in Economics 101 It's amazing that people can get away with it, and my colleagues in the media let them get away with it. But that's what drives the economy. 70% comes from consumption. The other 30% goes to investment and taxes, but that's minority. Not that they aren't important, but they are not the key driver. So this theory is that if you pay people well and they go out and shop, that drives companies to expand production, to build new plants, buy new equipment, hire more people, and that's a circular process. Each part of the process feeds and fuels the next part of the process, okay? So there must have been people who believed in this, who believed this was a smart idea. Not just generous, but smart. So I went back and I started to read, what did Charlie Wilson at General Motors believe? What did Reg Jones at General Electric believe? What did Frank Abrams at ExxonMobil believe? Not ExxonMobil, Standard Oil in Jersey back then became ExxonMobil. What did Peter Drucker, the management guru down in Southern California, preach to the people all around the country? They preached and they believed in what is called stakeholder capitalism. That is a very important word. Remember it. Stakeholder capitalism. What they meant by that was that every stakeholder in the corporation should get some of the benefits of the growth and the profits of that corporation. Now, who are the stakeholders? Obviously the owners, but also the managers, the workers, the employees, the suppliers, the creditors, the bankers that loan the money, the customers. The customer, you as a customer have a stake in the survival of any company whose product you buy for any length of time at all, whether it's a lawnmower, a refrigerator, a car, whatever. You want the company to be there to make good on the guarantee. We just bought a Weber grill. We had a little bit of a problem. So we're after Weber right now. But you want them to survive. You have a stake in it. So that's what these guys believed in. They actually believed in sharing the wealth. And what's interesting is you look at the Business Roundtable, the statements made by leaders of the Business Roundtable, which is the organization of the largest corporate CEOs in America. And they talk about this. They don't use the term stakeholder, but they talk about the groups that have an interest in the corporation surviving and the obligation. Some of them use the term the sacred trust of the CEO to balance the interests of the various stakeholders in the corporation. Amazing when you think about it today. So that's one thing that happened. The second thing that happened, and it's also very important for thinking about what to do in America today, and that is middle class prosperity depended very heavily on middle class power. Middle class power, people power, citizen power. If you go back and think about this era of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, this is an era of enormous civic activism in America. My first experience with it, as Don suggested, was covering the civil rights movement in the South. Martin Luther King, John Lewis, the rest of them. Enormous expansion of American democracy, pushed from below, from the belly of the land. Washington responded. Washington didn't initiate. The people demanded. The women's movement began roughly 50 years ago. Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique 50 years ago. John F. Kennedy wrote signed an equal pay law. Up until that point, women have been making 41 cents on the dollar for the same kind of work that men were doing. Today, it's 77 cents on the dollar. Still not there. We still have further to go, but it's a long ways better. And it's better because of that pressure, organized pressure from women on the government and on industry and business to pay more fairly. Very important. Glass ceiling, all those issues. The consumers movement. Ralph Nader wrote that book, Unsafe at Any Speed, about the American car manufacturers saying they were producing cars that had defects that were causing accidents, that were killing people. And that began and pushed a consumers movement. I think in 1963, 64, there were 11 new national consumer organizations that were formed, and then the Consumer Federation of America. And nowadays, when you go into the grocery store or you go into the drugstore and you're trying to figure out what's in a product, and whether or not it's safe and whether or not you want to buy it, you turn it over on the back and you look at the label. And when you look at the label and you can see the contents of that product, it is thanks to those people in the 1960s and 70s who were demonstrating to get fair labeling, truth in packaging, written into law. And Washington responded. The labor movement was enormously important. They pushed for the kind of benefits I was talking about. Slowly rising wages during the life of a 5-year contract, a health benefit paid for by the employer, a retirement benefit paid for by the employer. I'm not going to go through the details, but it's very important The labor movement is very important in the history of the middle class in America. And if you don't think it's important, you don't think it has much to do with you, just stop and think if there were no labor movement, you wouldn't have any weekends. It was the labor movement that came up with the idea of the 5-day week, the 40-hour week, child labor laws, all kinds of stuff. So give it another thought. And then the environmental movement, which is going to ring home, I think, with people up here. Do you know that on April 22nd, 1970, 20 million Americans went into the streets, into the shopping malls, into the university campuses, onto the radio, onto the airwaves, onto television, demanding the cleanup of America's filthy, polluted waterways and airways? 20 million people. That was almost 10% of the population. Within a year, Congress had passed 7 major pieces of environmental legislation in response to public demand. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Anti-Toxic Substances Act, and on and on and on. And all of them were signed by that great tree-hugging environmentalist Richard Nixon. Now, I happen to know Bill Ruckelshaus personally. Bill Ruckelshaus was the first head of the EPA appointed by Nixon. And I interviewed him, and as a matter of fact, I have a documentary which you can actually see online now at the Frontline website called Poison Waters about Puget Sound and Chesapeake Bay. We did it a few years ago. And I interviewed Bill for that show, and I said to him at one point, I said, Bill, what is it with Nixon? Did he really care about the environment? Did we just have the wrong picture of Nixon? He said, Rick, he said, in all the years I worked for Nixon, he never once asked me about the environment. He never once said, Bill, is it really bad out there? Is it true that if you put your arm into the Potomac River, it comes out covered with green slime algae? Is it true that the Cuyahoga River has so many chemicals in it, it literally bursts into flame? He said he never asked me one time. He said, but he did say, Bill, when you get over there, he said, don't get captured by those bureaucrats at EPA. EPA, think about it. Ruckelshaus said Nixon was the only guy in Washington who called the EPA EPA. He said that's how close he was to the environmental movement. So I said, okay, so why did he do it? He said he did it because the people demanded it. He was a practical politician. He faced Democrats that were pushing on the other side. The people demanded it. We had to act as a government. That's the way democracy is supposed to work. Those are Ruckelshaus's words. Think of them. That's the way democracy is supposed to work. Now just flash forward for a second. We'll take a moment of silence to think about today. The disconnect between Washington. I mean, you can see polls on one subject after another, whether it's gun control, the environment, tax rates, whatever, where you see majorities favor something and Congress does something else. So we've got a serious disconnect we need to deal with, okay? So that's what generated this society I was talking about before of shared wealth. And what happened? How did it unravel? Somebody's written a book called The Unwinding. I thought at one point of calling my book The Unraveling. I got a real problem, Don. I got to tell about 30 minutes of stuff in the next 7 minutes, so I'm going to do it real fast. There are 2 things that happened that are really important for you to understand, and I didn't know them myself. And it's both exciting for me to tell you this and embarrassing, because in the late 1970s, I was the Washington bureau chief of the New York Times, and some of this happened on my watch. And I want to tell you, I saw the symptoms, but I didn't know the causes. And that's true, by the way, of lots of Washington reporters today. I've talked to them about some of the stories that I've found and what I've reported in this book, and they don't know this stuff today. Part of the problem is journalism is history on the fly. You don't have time to go back and look at events, and you need to go back and look at events and dig underneath them in order to understand what happened. And when I went back and I did that, what I discovered was the pivotal period in American history in terms of the shift in American economic and political power and economic policy making was in the late 1970s. It actually predates Ronald Reagan. It's very interesting. And when I went back further, what I found out that there was a power shift. The 2 things that occurred that affected the way we cut up the pie and the way we operate in America today are the power shift in Washington and wedge economics taking place in the economy. The power shift was actually triggered by a guy named Lewis Powell, whose name may be familiar to you. He was a guy who was put on the Supreme Court in 1972 by Richard Nixon. He was actually very disturbed about a lot of the stuff that Nixon did. You may not be aware of this, but Nixon's policies were probably well to the left of Bill Clinton, certainly to the left of Barack Obama's and Jimmy Carter's. Nixon put in EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, Mine Safety Board, Traffic Safety Board, a lot of regulatory boards. Powell was a corporate attorney. He was very upset by the regulatory regime that was being installed by Nixon, much more by Nixon than by Lyndon Johnson, his Democratic predecessor. He was very concerned by the power of exactly the movements I've just ticked off to you, the women's movement, the environmental movement, the consumer movement, the labor movement. He mentions them by name. He talked to some of his friends in the U.S. Chamber of Commerce about what he was concerned about, and they said, why don't you write us a memo, and we'll circulate it to the leaders of American business around the country. That is exactly what Powell did. Powell wrote a memo, which is now called by historians the Powell Memorandum of August 1971, in which he said, basically point blank, business leaders, you are being taken to the cleaners in the political arena by the civil rights movement, the environmental movement, labor movement, consumer movement, women's movement, all those movements, and you need to get back in the political arena and fight and take the high ground. You need to organize, you need to go after your enemies aggressively, you need to pool your money, you need to have a long-term game plan. Well, what's remarkable is we didn't see it at the time. This memo was circulated by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and business leaders did respond. Now, they didn't respond just because they thought Lewis Powell was a wonderkind and a new Pied Piper. I mean, he was a Paul Revere. They were already worried. They were already upset. And so you had this revolt of the bosses. Within 4 or 5 months of his memo, the Business Roundtable was formed. There was no Business Roundtable in 1971. It is now the single most powerful political influence of business in Washington, Business Roundtable. So that got formed in response to the Powell memo. When Powell wrote his memo, there were only 175 companies that even had offices in Washington to talk to the government, let alone influence the government. Within 8 years, there were 2,425. There were 50,000 people working for business trade associations. There were 9,000 registered corporate lobbyists. There were 8,000 corporate PR people. There was an army. Within a decade, prior to the arrival of Ronald Reagan on the scene, that army had been formed, and it went to work in the Congress of 1978, which was the most pivotal Congress in the last 50 years of American history. And I doubt that there are many historians who've told you that. The reason I say that is because with Jimmy Carter in the White House and the Democrats in control of both houses of Congress, both the labor movement and the consumer movement thought they were finally going to get the legislation they had been looking for all along and couldn't get with Nixon and with Jerry Ford, Republicans in the White House. They got nowhere. Powell's army, the lobbyists, went to work, and the consumer bill for a consumer protection agency never got out of the House of Representatives. The labor bills that labor wanted for easier labor organizing and common site picketing on construction sites and so forth, several other pieces of legislation, got out of the House, but it didn't get out of the Senate. They got bottled up. And then business lobbyists went to work on the other side. I mentioned before the 401k plan was written into law in 1978, and it's changed the retirement picture and the financing of retirement for the last 40 years. It got written in that year. The corporate bankruptcy law got changed that year. You're talking geek stuff, Rick. Wonk. You know, nobody's going to pay attention to this. No, we didn't pay any attention to this. It was too hard to understand. But the way the corporate bankruptcy law was changed in 1978, it gave much more power during the process of bankruptcy to the existing management of the corporation that was in trouble. And when you start to see the steel industry go bankrupt one company after another and the airline industry go bankrupt one company after another, you begin to see that management does well and the ordinary workers do terribly. They suffer enormous losses, and it can be traced back to this change of legislation in 1978. That same Congress, under pressure from the Wall Street banks, passed an interest law that overruled the state usury laws. States had laws that said there's a limit on what interest rate you can charge on mortgage loans, on student loans, on auto loans, and on credit cards. And Wall Street said, we can't do business with the people who are bad risks. We need to take the top off the interest rates from 7 or 8 or 9% and boost it up to 20%. And that's exactly what Congress agreed to do. That set the basis for the subprime crisis that came along in the late 90s and early 2000s. And by the way, I don't know if you ever pay part of your credit card bill or you're a little late on your credit card. Have you ever noticed what interest rate you're paying? Now, you're a 7, 8, or 9% borrower. You should be getting the best rates. You're not paying that. You're paying 20 to 22%. Once they got those rates in, they started applying them to everybody. Okay, so that got started in 1978. The next thing what happened was Jimmy Carter wanted to change the tax law He wanted to close loopholes on the wealthy. He wanted to drop some low-income people at the bottom, and he wanted to increase the corporate tax rate. When the tax bill came back from Congress and the lobbyists had gone to work on it, the wealthy loopholes were not cut. The people were not dropped from the income rolls. The corporate tax rate, instead of going up 2% to help balance the budget, came down 2%. The size is not what's critical. What's critical is the direction of policy and the capital gains rate, which everybody benefits from if you invest. But you need to understand that today in America, 50% of the capital gains and capital gains taxes go to the top 1%, okay? So it's highly concentrated to the benefit of the people at the absolute top of the income spectrum. That came down from 48%, capital gains rate from 48% to 28%. I go through those details to let you know that that Congress was absolutely pregnant with action. I haven't even mentioned all of it. There's deregulation and so forth. We saw these things happening. When I was running the Washington Bureau of the Times, we saw these things happening. We had no idea that there was this new lobbying force that was at work. We just began to see that the political dynamics had dramatically changed. That was a game changer period. We've been with it ever since. I can carry it forward. I don't have time, but the book carries that story forward to today, and you can see what is called the Gang of Six today are the 6 most powerful business lobbying organizations in Washington. You'll see other gangs referred to, but the one that counts the most with the most power is the Gang of Six. Now, the last thing is this wedge economics. I mentioned to you before that the people like Charlie Wilson and the other CEOs in the 50s, 60s, and 70s believed in stakeholder capitalism. Today, you practically never see that term used in the media. What you see instead is shareholder capitalism. Shareholder capitalism is about winner take all. Shareholder capitalism means that the CEO believes his or her responsibility is to deliver the maximum return to shareholders. Now, if you're interested in doing that, you want to push the stock price up. If you're interested in doing that, you want to push profits up. You're going to hold wages level. You may even push them down. You may even ship jobs overseas. But there's a tension between, it's a zero-sum game going on between profits up and wages. It's the exact opposite of stakeholder capitalism. And in fact, when you go back and look and see what's happened, and I don't have time to go through all the details here, but if you look and see what's happened, from 1945 to 1975, the productivity of the American workforce roughly doubled. It went up 96.8%. The level of the median family income went 95% during that period. 97%, 95%, almost dollar for dollar. As the economy became more efficient, as the corporations became more profitable, and as the economy grew, it translated through to a rising living standard for the great mass of middle Americans and everybody above. Matter of fact, there are economic studies that show that over that 30-year period, if you divide the economy into quintiles, top 20%, second 20%, and so on and so forth, that all 5 quintiles, average income went up. In fact, they went up more at the bottom than at the top during that 30-year period. What's happened since then is very important. From 1975 to 2011, the productivity of the American workforce went up 80%. 80%. Median family income went up 10% during that period. 80% and 10%. And the only reason it went up is because more women worked more hours. You had more family work time in the workplace than before. But if you just take men, a constant, if you take the average male worker right in the middle of the economy, from 1978 to 2011, the Census Bureau told us last year they made the same amount of money, adjusted for inflation. 3 decades of going nowhere. Income in the top 1% during that period went up 600%. Income for CEOs of large corporations went up 350 to 400%. From 1978 to 2011, Alan Krieger, an economist at Princeton, reported 84% of the entire growth in the economy went to the top 1%. 84%. We're talking 7/8 of the whole growth over a period of 3 or 4 decades, and it all went to the top 1%. In fact, 2 years ago, the gains of the top 1% exceeded 100% of the gains in the national income that year, which means the other 99%, everybody else lost money collectively. Now, we got something really screwed up under that kind of situation. Last 2 minutes. What do we do about it? And we'll spend, I hope, a lot of time talking about that in the question period. I was reluctant to get into this. When I turned in the first draft of my book, and I wrote 5 drafts, my editor, Kate Medina at Random House, said, "Rick, you got us in a ditch." I've just described it to you. "You got to get us out." I said, "Kate, I'm a reporter. You know, my job is to call balls and strikes, fair and foul. It's up to the policy wonks and the president and Congress and ordinary citizens to decide what they want." She said, "Oh no, you've painted too tough a picture. You got to help us out." And I resisted her for a while, and then the chief editor in my family, Susan Zox, who's sitting over there in the corner with our dog Ziggy, with a nice smile on her face, said to me, "Rick, Kate's right." And so at the end of my book, you've got 2 chapters of Hedrick Smith's handy-dandy 10-point plan to save America. Now, I put it that way, and you laugh because I'm uncomfortable as a reporter doing that. But there's some obvious things to do. They're not that unusual. They're not that hard to come by. I went out and read what other people were doing, and I thought about it. You know, we've got an income tax, corporate income tax system which rewards companies for shipping jobs overseas. Why don't we just level that? We have a transportation system in America which the Chamber of Commerce, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Voice of Business says has cost us $1 trillion in growth because it's so backward. Susan and I have been to Shenzhen, China. I first went to Shenzhen, China in 1994. There was no port in Shenzhen, China in 1994. Today it is the 3rd largest port in the world, totally modernized, totally computerized, doing more business than Long Beach, Los Angeles, and San Francisco ports combined, and doing it with more modern equipment. We have bottlenecks in our railroad system so that it takes less time to run a freight train from Los Angeles to Chicago than it does to get it 15 miles through the city of Chicago. And we just have slews of examples like that. And the bridge down here on the Skagit River is just one of hundreds and hundreds of examples around this country. We have an outdated transportation system that is causing us. If you don't think there's much delay, think about it. You're just slowing down from 70 to 40 to go through the temporary bridge. That's going on all over the country. There are roads all over the country that are slowing people down. It's costing the economy. So that's another thing we could do. We could modernize our transportation system, which would not only make us more competitive as a nation, but it would give people jobs. The people who make the highways and modernize the ports and so forth have jobs. The people who make the steel, who make the cement, who make the electronic equipment, they would have jobs. What we need is jobs. We need to generate demand in order to generate growth. So those are things that we need to do. We need to do something about the students who are now stuck with $1 trillion worth of debt, and Congress can't agree to lower the interest rate for students who are our hope for the future. If we're going to be competitive in the future, we need kids who are educated. And we keep saying that. What do? Charge them more so they can't afford it. Doesn't make much sense. You wouldn't run a business that way, would you? So we're doing some things politically that don't make much sense. But my answer in the end is that, and I've got a bunch of other economic policies that are not radical. I think they're sensible. You may disagree, but that's all right. You'll have your own ideas. But I don't think these things are going to change in Washington unless there is pressure from out here. We've got to recreate and restore the political middle. You're on the way in Washington State. We're on the way in Washington State. Open primaries are a great idea. The turnout in this state has already gone up since the open primaries were introduced. It's pushing candidates to run more towards the center and less towards the extreme. We've got to start beating gerrymandering, which is terrible for the extremes. But most importantly, we got to get back to that mood of middle-class activism. We, the people, have got to take action. That's actually those are the last 6 words of my book. We, the people, must take action. We've got to get back into that frame of mind of the civil rights movement, the environmental movement, the women's movement, the consumer movement, to say, well, we're going to put in our demands. We're going to insist on it, and we're going to hang in there. We're not just going to vote for people in office, because all the damage gets done between the elections. Notice it? Get an election outcome that's reasonably close to what you voted for, and then watch what happens. That's the time we need to keep staying engaged. I've got a lot more to say about that, but I think I better stop. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate it.
Okay, so now we're ready for questions, and as our policy is, badge-wearing members may ask questions. We have Victoria over here and Chuck here with microphones, so please raise your hand and ask the question into the microphone. Remember, we had one speech today, that's all. We just need a question now. Thank you very much.
Wow, do I like those rules.
Hi, I just wonder if you agree with this statement. We've had a whole generation, 30 years, of kids soaked in the ideology of free market libertarianism. There was the Reagan-Thatcher era, and of course Lewis Powell. And so they've been kind of neutralized, I think, compared to my generation. But yeah, it's a question. So I'm wondering, but what propelled this way forward, starting with NAFTA, was free trade. As the Atlantic magazine said, you know, the 1% don't need us anymore as markets or as labor because they have their friends in Mumbai and Moscow. So how do we get the free trade thing out there in the media? There's a complete blackout on it. We have TPP coming up and possibly fast track. How do we get it out there? How do we get people moving?
Well, I'm doing my best right here today. Okay. No, I think one thing we do is we need to get people to have a realistic dialogue about what's going on. I mean, we have this idea that it's individual entrepreneurs that have created all the value, and they haven't. I mean, they've done very important things. You've got some right in this area. Bill Gates is a very important guy, but he wasn't able to do it without being able to get all those trained engineers and computer scientists, which were generated by university systems, many of which were public financed or which had public tax breaks. So I mean, there's a whole way in which the general public is involved in the success of individuals. But I think that we don't get into the argument about free trade. We stay with the argument about economic inequality. We cannot move forward as a nation. We are in the process of decline as a nation unless we deal with this issue of inequality. And I think it's very important to make sure that the agenda that we're talking about is, well, number one is our agenda, but more importantly is the agenda that's really going to make a difference. And if you're talking about that, then as you approach those trade agreements, the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement or whatever you're talking about, then you have a yardstick against which to measure it. And the yardstick, is it going to increase jobs in this country? Is it going to increase or decrease economic inequality in this country? And if the answer is, well, we're not sure about jobs, or it's the same guys who promised us jobs when we opened the trade with China, and in fact we didn't get it, we got the opposite, then we set them aside and we remind everybody else, these guys have been out here before and they've told us this, let's just set them aside and talk to some other people about it. And then the question is it going to reduce economic inequality? And if you look at the policies we've had in Washington in the last 3 or 4 years, they've been going the wrong way. If you look at what's happened in the last 4 years in the American economy, the problem of economic inequality has gotten worse, not better, even as the economy has recovered. Corporate profits for the last 4 years went up 20.1% on average each year. That's more than 80%. Median household income went up 1.4% for the last 4 years. The gap is getting wider. We need policies that will narrow the gap because, not just because it's fair. In fact, there are lots of economic studies out there that will tell us that greater economic equality generates greater growth for all. High income inequality is a bad formula for growth. It's a drag on growth. There are actually international studies that say it's destructive to growth. So I think we just need to stay on this really firm wicket. And we're not looking for equality. We're just looking for a correction for this egregious inequality that exists in our economic system and then spills over into our political system. We better move on.
The
84% of the total income growth.
growth, but the amount of the employment less than 10%, 70, and now I've seen
23%. Right.
have you or any of your colleagues drawn a comparison with the federal budget? Right now we're told we have to cut the federal budget, and that's 20%. You got the 1%, and that's drawing down the economy. Yet 23% going someplace else is not discussed in that context.
Yeah, I see your point. It is hard to get into that because when you're talking about the size of the federal budget, you're talking about the size of the private sector versus the size of the public sector. And we're talking about income shares. You're talking about strata within the society. So I think that's a hard argument to make. But you can turn around and say, by the way, that the growth of the debt of the big banks on Wall Street is about 4 times as great as the growth of the federal government's debt. So if you're worried about debt, we should be worried about the debt of the big banks and break them up. You know, there are ways in which you can use that kind of an argument, sort of not mixing apples and pears, but mixing apples and apples. Oh, no question about it. I got a wonderful chapter on that. The cheating and on the manipulation of stock options and the way they cheat the shareholders. It's a scandal. But that's another whole afternoon we can do on that. Okay, yeah, okay.
I'm over here.
Great.
I don't want to risk City Club's standing as a
Nonpartisan.
nonpartisan
Great.
group. But I was present at a discussion on this very topic earlier in the week, and the most cogent thing I heard was a man who stood up and said he had the solution. And the solution is, do not vote for any male Republicans. He said, give the women a chance without the guys there. They may come through and do something, but don't vote for male Republicans.
I'm not going to make a comment on that. That stands for itself. I think we're on to the next question back there.
Yeah, and it's a great segue to what I was going to ask. Most of the room, and you certainly up close, have seen the deterioration of what passes for dialogue in the Congress over the past years, the same period you're talking about. Excuse me, redistricting won't happen again until the next census. How can you not feel powerless, even though we're in Washington State, we're doing the things you've suggested in open primaries, how can you not feel powerless when you look at the other parts of the country that voted for these people that are the chief reason that there's a deadlock and that there's a gridlock?
Yeah.
Your ideas are excellent. But
Yeah. Well, I understand that, but my answer to that is keep moving. I understand the discouragement there, but I don't know what the gerrymandering situation is in the state, but I believe we still have gerrymandered legislative and congressional districts, even though we have open primaries. That's the next step. Listen, you are very important. You're very important in what you've done with the opening of the primaries, because there now is an example that other states can look at. You know, take a look around the country. There are now 16 states that have passed resolutions to repeal the decision of Citizens United. There are 7 or 8 states that now have public financing of political campaigns. I mean, these things all start small and grow. For God's sake, don't stop. Keep going. It's very important, because there are other people who want to do these things in other states, and the fact that it's going on here is very important. So, I mean, I do understand your frustration. Believe me, I share it. But don't let it cause you not to keep going. There's more to do. Okay, there are organizations working on this. There's Americans for Campaign Finance Reform. There's No Labels. There's Fair Elections. All these organizations are national organizations. They're all online. They're all working to try to protect getting out maximum vote. They're out to stop the partisan redistricting of districts. They're out to work against the influence of big money in campaigns. There's still big issues out there. And the fact that you've actually won here and have a good principle here is something to build on. It's something to be optimistic about. Yes, we'll have to go down and deal with South Carolina and Mississippi and North Carolina. And by the way, and Michigan and Pennsylvania. Do you know that in the congressional campaign, more people voted for Democratic candidates? And I say this in a nonpartisan way, because I'm going to tell you, in Massachusetts and Connecticut and my former home state of Maryland, the Democrats gerrymandered districts to the great disadvantage of Republicans, and I think that discredits our election system. So I'm not just picking on Republicans, but in this last congressional election, more people nationwide voted for Democratic candidates than for Republicans, but the Republicans came out with a 33-vote majority in the House, largely because of gerrymandering. In the state of Michigan, more people voted Democratic than Republican, and the Republicans got, listen to these numbers, 13 seats, and the Democrats got 5. It wasn't like a tilt of 1 or 2 seats. It's outrageous. In North Carolina, the same thing happened. It was 9 Republican seats and 4 Democrat. In Pennsylvania, it's 9 and 5. So the gerrymandering is horrendous. It's not only tilting the results of the election and skewing them, It is generating safe seats on both sides, so there's no contest, so you get a much more extreme, and they get much more dug in, and that's one reason we can't get compromise back in Washington. So keep going. Don't stop, please.
We have a question here. Besides gerrymandering, it's my observation that the American public is kept divided. The women fight the men. The Republicans fight the liberals. What are your views on that? If we could ever get together, you know, over many of the topics you're talking about, we could get something done. But as long as we keep fighting each other, we're never going to reach a consensus.
Well, I agree with you to a point. And the question is, what can we do in our procedures and our methods that will help bring us together? Because I can tell you that in Washington, when I first went there, Republicans and Democrats in the House used to play basketball together. They used to go on junkets together. Republicans, junkets, you know, these trips abroad or trips to air bases to go inspect them, or if they're looking at housing or whatever, they would go do it in a bipartisan way. They used to have their freshman orientation together. Now they do it by party. I mean, it's really bad. And the Senate dining room used to be a place where people from both parties would sit down and have lunch together. Senate dining room today is nearly deserted. So, I mean, the separation is real. And you know this from your own personal relations or your business relations, whatever. You don't really do good business unless you begin to get to know people. And, of course, there are people you disagree with. But when you sit down, you begin to find points of agreement. So, yeah, I think part of it is we've got to let folks in Washington know that we find this intolerable behavior. But that only works if people get defeated in elections in the long run. Politicians are like other people. They're interested in keeping their jobs first and foremost. But I do think that doing something about gerrymandering is absolutely essential. Having open primaries and fixing gerrymandering, because as you get rid of the safe districts, you force not only the candidates, but the people who write their ads, the people who are the strategists of their campaigns, the people who go to get out the vote, they all have to start trying to get the people on the other side of the aisle, or the independents, or the moderates in the middle. So fixing, you said aside from gerrymandering, that's a huge aside. If we could do something about gerrymandering in a few states in this country and begin to see some different results, it would have a tremendous effect. Listen, it's taken us 30 years to get into this mess. We're not going to get out in the next 6 months. But I mean, we need to have the kind of grit. You know, if you think about Rosa Parks, she had her demonstration against, Jim Crow, making her sit in the back of the bus in Montgomery in 1955. It was a decade before the Civil Rights Act was passed. So we got to be prepared for that kind of a battle. We got to, get a little bit of toughness in our stomach. Say this is terrible, and we're going to do something about it, and we're not going to hang up until it's done. Yeah.
Hi. I'm involved in the Public Banking Institute, and I'm wondering if you're aware of that group and Ellen H. Brown's book, Web of Debt, and the idea of establishing public banks either on the county level or state level.
It's a great question. I know Ellen Brown's writing. I get her writing every time she writes on the internet. I follow her closely. You're talking about, I think, something much broader than just public banking. I want to broaden it, if I may. We're talking about, are there ways to set up, back to your question about how we can get together, sir, and solve problems, are there ways in which we can set up alternative kinds of institutions that are responsive to people at the bottom and are not kind of partisan, either politically partisan or kind of economically partisan, and they want to open up the economic system? There are now laws, I don't know if there's one in Washington State, but there are now laws in several states, particularly California, for what are called benefit corporations. And the idea is that some members, and a lot of them, members of boards of directors of major corporations say, we can't do anything but pursue maximum return for our shareholders because that's part of our charter, and if we don't do it, we'll be sued. So the idea is to pass a law which says there are a variety of things that a corporation can do. It can do things for the public welfare, it can do things for the benefit of the community and so forth, so that the board of directors can, without fear of lawsuit, whether they're running a public bank or they're running a production manufacturing institution, can say, We're balancing these interests. We're doing stakeholder capitalism. In other words, benefit corporations, and benefit corporation law is law that institutionalizes the idea of stakeholder capitalism. And in my opinion, if I understand public banking, to a great extent, that's what it stands for. But you want to add something else, so go ahead.
No, we have a question here. I'm
Okay.
sorry. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, you got lapped. I'll talk to you afterwards.
Yeah, I want to talk about public banking too.
Oh, that's great.
I'll come and talk to you afterwards. But we were talking about gerrymandering, and what 80% of the democracies in the world have is a different electoral system
Yeah.
to begin with, namely proportional representation.
Right.
And then if a candidate gets 10% of the vote, or if a party gets 10% of the vote, they get 10% of the representation in the
Right.
parliament. So what
Good.
about
Well,
that?
Yeah, well, as far as I'm concerned, that's a fine idea. I think changing our gerrymandered system is going to be very difficult. I think getting to proportional representation is going to be harder. But I have to say that we ought to go back to an old American notion that comes from the progressive era of the 1910s, 20s, on into the 30s, which is the states are laboratories for potential national solutions. And if in some state people want to go push for, or even in some city or in some county, people want to start to push for proportional representation, and it becomes a model that other people can look at, I'm all for that. I think that's a great idea. I mean, it's the free market of political ideas as well as the free market of economic profit seeking. So I think that's a great idea. I think as a national system, it's going to be tough until we have some local examples that show the benefits of that kind of a system. But more power to it, go for it. And I didn't mean to cut you off there. I just know that they're trying to get other people included.
Another question here.
I'm concerned about the gap that exists between those of us who vote for candidates who win and then the failure of those candidates to represent the matters that they had told us that they would be working on, and they go to Congress and they follow a corporate agenda rather than what they promised us. How
Bingo.
do we heal that breach?
Bingo. Bingo, bingo, bingo. Okay, I'm with you. That's the big deal. Well, one way has to be to invite your neighbors to a meeting to talk about that, and have everybody in this room have 10 neighbors in to talk about that, and then form an organization here that says we are going to follow up after the election in the congressional district we're in. And then if that district begins to get a more responsive member of Congress, then you move it to another district, or you do it in a state. We are going to have to get the lesson that you just gave us, which is the disconnect begins the morning after the election. The election campaign, actually, there are lots of flaws in our election campaigns, but actually they work better than what happens after the election. That's the time we have to pay attention. And I think there's no answer to organized money other than organized people. Folks in this room, my hunch is, my hunch is, and it certainly goes for me, the folks in this room do not have enough money to match the Koch brothers or whoever on the other side. So the only thing we've got is our bodies. The only thing we've got are ourselves. And let me tell you, from lots of years of reporting in Congress, I can tell you that no matter who they are, almost no matter who they are, almost without exception, I know that members of Congress are extremely sensitive when they know there is an organized body of people in their district that is going to hang in on an issue and not go away. What they count on is you're showing up for one meeting with the representative when he or she comes home, ask your question, get a lousy answer, go away and grumble to your neighbors, and forget about it. Right? This is like a healthcare system that says, "I'm sorry, we're not going to pay for your bill. It's too bad, Mr. Jones." This is. I mean, you've run into it. There are bureaucracies all over our society. A lot of them in the private sector as well as in the public sector. They're counting on your giving up. The answer is don't give up. It's the same answer I gave out there. You're right on exactly on the right issue. That's where we need to start.
My son is 32 years old. He's traveling across country with a musical group right now. I sent him your book. I just got a text from him yesterday that says his book is scary. He's contemplating starting a family. The story is complex. I taught in this area political economy for 20 years. This is a complex story. How do we convey to people like my son and others of that age what's going on? I find it difficult myself. I didn't see it. I taught in this area. I taught some of this stuff that, maximize shareholder wealth. I taught finance, and I didn't look at it in much the same way you mentioned that you didn't see the whole picture. How do we get to the young?
Well, let me say to you a couple of things first off. Number one, that's a great and important question. One way would be to get a few young people to attend this session. I don't mean just this session, but I mean, one way would be to sit down and stop to think about how to restructure the way these events are held. And I say that only because you've obviously got a very successful organization. I say that not as a criticism, but as a potential to expand the benefits. Okay? So the first thing is, it's interesting. There are lots of things that we take for granted. I did a documentary series for the NewsHour some years ago on the problem of getting people to work in chip fabs in Austin, Texas. Now the chip fabs, and this is related, the chip fabs were gravitated to set up in Austin, Texas because the University of Texas was graduating lots of wonderfully talented electrical engineers and computer sciences and so forth. So they thought, wow, there's a great personnel base and there's an educated community there, and we'll go there. They set up, and within about 3 or 4 years, they discovered they didn't have enough people to work in the clean rooms. Now, these are people who need to be able to handle very sophisticated equipment, but they don't need a college degree. They don't need a science degree. They either need a very, very, very good high school education or a couple of years of community college. So they set up a community college training program to retrain people from other fields in semiconductors. And then somebody said, but we got to get kids from high school involved and kids from grade school. And they said, but nobody wants to study math and science. So then somebody said, has anybody ever had an open house in a computer chip fab and invited the kids and their families in so that junior high school and high school kids can get excited about being engineers and seeing the building of these computer chips and so forth? They started to do that, and they began to change the high school attendance in math and science and technology. I think as a generation, we've got a lot of talented people. We've got a certain number of people with more time on their hands, more energy, great memory of how we were more effective as a country. This is a time when we can turn around and draw those people in. Your son should be scared by my book. My book is a scary book. It wasn't designed to be a scary book, but it came out a scary book because I tried to tell the truth, and the truth is scary, okay? Now, my hope is your son got to the end of the book and he began to read some of the things at the end of the book that talk about what we can do. But then he needs, if he's alarmed, he needs to help organize wherever he goes the people in his generation to talk about the same thing. But we need to open up a dialogue between generations about this issue. Because our kids are, I mean, if you look at the dedication of my book, it's dedicated to my kids and my grandchildren, for whom I hope will have a better world. That's who I'm concerned about. That's why I wrote this book. And if I ever find somebody who asks me to sign a book and they want to give it to their kids, I'll say, hold to the kids. And the first thing I write is, this book is for you and your generation. So I think we have to take that attitude. We can do it. We have to open up ourselves in a new way. And you're a teacher. You'd be marvelously equipped to do that. I just appointed you the head of a task force. I'm kidding, but it has to be much more than a wish. It has to be an action.
What role, how well, or how badly have the news media performed during this developing mess that your book is about?
We performed really badly. We've performed really badly. Now, we performed badly. I say we performed badly. I think in the end, I think we have a very short-sighted concept of news, both the news producers and the news consumers. We have this notion that news is what happened in the last 24 hours. No. News is what you discovered in the last 24 hours. And if you learn something new that actually happened 20 years ago, but it sheds light on what's going on today, that's news. Now, I can't persuade my colleagues very often that that's the case. But there are publications, and I'm going to sound prejudiced because I worked for the New York Times for 26 years, but I got to tell you, every day I'm learning stuff from that paper. It's unbelievable the amount of information that is in that paper. Every day, on all kinds of subjects. Ethics in Wall Street, scientific discoveries, all kinds of stuff. So there are other outlets that have it. But the problem is, we were listening this morning. I can't remember what my wife said to me this morning. My God, they were doing something about how animal trainers in Florida were getting in trouble because the alligators were snapping at their heads or their legs. How in God's name did that add one thing other than a moment's entertainment to your knowledge about how the world works? And the difficulty is, understand this, that's a failure of the media, but it is also a failure of the audience, because the audience is tuning in because the audience wants to be titillated rather than being informed. So part of what has to happen is the audience has got to be much more sophisticated and much more demanding and saying, this isn't good enough. And go sit down and talk to the people at WBAI or at the Bellingham Herald or whatever the institution is, the Seattle Times or whatever, and say, look, this is going on here and we don't see this reported. And don't just do it once. Go back. And news media people pay attention. I mean, I was an editor, an executive at the New York Times, and we paid attention if people, raised things seriously with us. If they just called us and gave us a harangue about something wrong in a story, we ran a correction and we didn't take it terribly. It didn't have much of a dent. But if you hear from people who are really thoughtful saying, you're really missing the boat. But think about it. How do you know that Apple has been evading taxes to the tune of $8 billion a year? You know about it. How do you know that the NSA has done the eavesdropping? Well, you know about it. So stuff is getting out. There was a leak, but there were also organizations that were ready to take the leaking. By the way, we did a documentary on that 6 years ago, and it's on PBS, and you can see it. It's called Spying on the Home Front, on Frontline. But my point is there's stuff out there. We in the media have to be much more demanding, have to have a much higher standard of what news is. And you, or we the audience, I'm now a consumer, we have to be more demanding of our media and say, we don't want all this other stuff. All right, run a feature page, do a style section, have a family and home section, but don't pretend it's front page news. We want to know about the world. It goes both ways.
Thank you, Rick. We can't let you get away without giving you something. Our Whatcom places too. So when you and Susan are up this weekend, you can enjoy some of the wonderful places we have. Thank you again. It was wonderful. Really appreciate it.
I just want to thank you all as an audience. You're wonderful. You're so engaged and so attentive. Go do something.
And come back next month.